Observe now, a land once cloaked in the sheen of technology, concrete ambitions, and relentless might. The 77th year of the Israeli state was meant to mark a celebration, a triumph of survival and supremacy. But what unfolded instead was a seismic reversal, one carved not by time, but by a single strike. It came without fan, fair, silent wings, guided fire, perhaps a whisper of code in a digital system. In one night, Iran's calculated blow pierced the illusion of invincibility. Anti-air systems, praised for decades, faltered. The sky turned red, steel fell, stone cracked. The world watched as the great fortress faltered. Tel Aviv, once glittering with innovation, stood broken, its skyline now a silhouette of ruin. Neighborhoods burned, sirens wailed. Aerial shots told a tale once reserved for Gaza's alleyways and broken hospitals, but now the imagery had flipped. Here, in the heart of Israel, the symmetry of suffering emerged. Children clutched mothers in makeshift shelters, water lines ran dry, aid convoys arrived not at Rafah, but to the heart of Tel Aviv and Ashdod. The world, for a moment, couldn't distinguish between the oppressed and the one, suppressor. Screens blurred and borders felt abstract, and in this paradox lies a deeper rhythm of history correcting its course, or perhaps echoing a new warning. For years, power flowed in one direction, but today it recoils. The land groans not with triumph, but with humility. The question now ripples across the region: will this devastation lead to reflection, to justice, to a shared humanity, or will it ignite another storm, a darker, more furious cycle of vengeance? Only time shall tell, but today we bear witness, not just to destruction, but to a truth long buried beneath politics and power. All walls, no matter how fortified, crumble in the face of human consequence. The creation of Israel in 1948 marked the birth of a nation shaped by conflict, survival, and relentless pursuit of security. Over the next 77 years, Israel transformed from a vulnerable newborn state into one of the most advanced military and technological powers in the region. Its journey was marked by regional wars, peace treaties, economic booms, and a relentless focus on self-defense. Through its Iron Dome, precision surveillance, cyber capabilities, and robust intelligence networks, Israel presented itself as impenetrable, a fortress against hostile neighbors, especially Iran, which it viewed as an existential threat. But beneath the surface of strength, a certain overconfidence began to build. Its cities grew vertically, its systems relied heavily on technological shields, and its leadership leaned into deterrence strategies rather than diplomatic resolutions. In this context, the 77th year was expected to be a moment of symbolic affirmation, proof that despite regional instability, Israel stood firm, modern, and untouchable, that illusion shattered in one decisive moment. A well-coordinated Iranian strike, utilizing either advanced drone swarms, hypersonic missiles, or a hybrid of kinetic and cyber attacks, slipped through the cracks of Israel's defenses. The systems that had long protected Israeli airspace hesitated or failed. Within minutes, symbols of Israeli power air bases, communication towers, energy grids collapsed. Civilian infrastructure took unexpected hits, and entire neighborhoods were turned to rubble. The impact went beyond physical damage. It struck deep into the national psyche, revealing that even the most fortified nations can be blindsided. This moment forced a national and global reckoning. For decades, Israel had operated with strategic superiority, often engaging in preemptive strikes and overwhelming responses. But this singular blow reversed the direction of fear. Israel, the symbol of endurance and control, now looked fragile. Cities that once hosted technological conferences now resembled zones of humanitarian crisis. The contrast between expectation and reality was stark. It was not merely a military failure. It was a transformation of perception. The Israeli people, long used to viewing conflict from a place of strategic dominance, were now experiencing the chaos of vulnerability, the randomness of destruction, and the helplessness that had defined life in Gaza for years. What had taken 77 years to build unraveled in hours, altering the face and identity of the state itself. In the aftermath of the Iranian strike, a disturbing visual symmetry began to emerge between Israel and Gaza, two regions historically defined by vastly different realities of power and suffering. Images coming from Israeli cities bore an uncanny resemblance to the war-torn neighborhoods of Gaza that the world had grown used to seeing. Streets lined with debris, collapsed buildings, and smoke rising from residential areas mirrored scenes that had for years been associated with the Palestinian struggle. This was not merely a coincidence of destruction, but a deeper reflection of a shifting moral and geopolitical narrative. The areas in southern and central Israel that were hardest hit began to experience conditions long attributed to Gaza: loss of electricity, water shortages, overwhelmed hospitals, and large-scale displacement. Israeli civilians were now the ones fleeing, huddling in shelters and relying on emergency aid. For a nation accustomed to control, this role reversal struck with jarring force. The comparisons intensified as humanitarian agencies and global media began reporting from the ground. International headlines that once focused on the aftermath of Israeli airstrikes in Gaza were now describing similar crises in Tel Aviv, Ashkelon, and Beersheba. Aid organizations that had long operated in Gaza were now deploying resources inside Israel. The visuals created an uncomfortable parallel, one that challenged long-standing narratives of who suffers, who survives, and who holds power in the region. Some journalists even described parts of Israel as looking like Gaza, a statement loaded with irony and historical weight. For many outside observers, it became difficult to ignore the stark role reversal. The cities that once launched drones and airstrikes were now themselves subjects of devastation. This resemblance sparked a wider moral debate. Critics and analysts questioned whether the suffering now visible in Israel would open space for empathy toward those who had endured similar or worse conditions for years in Gaza. Would Israelis now see their enemies through a new lens, shaped by shared experience of vulnerability? Or would this suffering harden positions further, fueling deeper cycles of vengeance? The resemblance between Israel and Gaza in the days following the strike was more than aesthetic. It was symbolic, a visual echo of pain that had long been confined to one side, but now blurred the lines between occupier and occupied. The transformation was not just in landscape, but in narrative, exposing the fragility of all human systems when confronted with the full force of war. As the dust settled and emergency sirens faded, the world turned its eyes toward Israel in disbelief. For decades, global media had covered the Israeli, Palestinian conflict through a familiar lens, one in which Israel, though occasionally criticized, was often portrayed as a state defending itself against terrorism. But the scale and shock of the Iranian strike disrupted that narrative entirely. Within hours, images of destroyed high-rises, frantic families seeking shelter, and overwhelmed hospitals in Israeli cities began circulating worldwide. News anchors, accustomed to reporting on Gaza's devastation, now spoke in stunned tones about the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Tel Aviv and its surrounding areas. The symmetry between these reports and past coverage of Gaza was impossible to ignore. Media outlets began drawing direct comparisons, some even publishing side-by-side visuals showing bombed-out neighborhoods in both regions. This sudden reversal of perspective triggered a wave of commentary across social platforms, newspapers, and international forums. Headlines that once centered around Israel's military precision were now focused on civilian casualties and systemic breakdowns within Israel itself. Analysts and journalists from various backgrounds started exploring the question of moral equivalence. If Israel had long justified its aggressive tactics as necessary for security, what then could be said when it found itself in the same condition it had inflicted on others? Commentators in Europe, the Middle East, and even within Israel began to reflect on the consequences of long-term conflict narratives that had dehumanized one side while valorizing the other. The Iranian strike forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. On social media, viral clips and hashtags compared the destruction in Israel with that of Gaza, not to diminish the suffering, but to highlight the long, ignored pain of the other side. Influencers, activists, and even some Israeli voices expressed shock at how quickly the tables had turned. There was an emerging awareness that this tragedy, while unique in its context, echoed years of pain previously confined to Palestinian territories. Media, watchdogs, and humanitarian organizations began calling for a more balanced view, asking whether this event might reshape the way conflicts are reported in the future. The narrative shift was not complete, but a door had opened. A moment of raw, global attention had created space for deeper questions about justice, suffering, and the stories we choose to tell about war and peace. The aftermath of the Iranian strike revealed a profound moral irony that echoed through every shattered building and displaced family. For years, Israel had operated from a position of overwhelming strength, projecting military dominance over its neighbors and justifying its actions as defensive necessity. Yet, in a single moment, the state that once symbolized strategic superiority found itself immersed in the very conditions it had inflicted on others. Streets that were once symbols of modernity and control now mirrored the ruins of Gaza's refugee camps. Families who once watched war unfold on distant screens now huddled in dark basements, unsure if the next explosion would claim their homes. This transformation was not just physical but symbolic, raising deeply uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, power, and consequence. The irony was sharp and unavoidable. Israel, which had justified civilian casualties in Gaza as collateral damage in the pursuit of security, was now appealing to the world for compassion and support in its own time of crisis. Its leadership, once unwavering in its rhetoric about deterrence and strength, now spoke with urgency about vulnerability and victimhood, For many observers, especially in the global south and parts of the Arab world, this shift exposed the hypocrisy embedded in the global response to conflict. The nations that had previously defended Israeli actions now had to grapple with images of Israeli suffering that mirrored those they had long dismissed or minimized in Palestinian territories. This moral reversal resonated beyond the region. In academic circles, human rights forums, and online debates, the conversation turned toward historical cycles of power and how quickly roles can reverse. The powerful can become the powerless, and the oppressor can experience the very pain they once justified. It led to renewed reflection on the principle of reciprocity in human empathy, how often people fail to acknowledge suffering until they endure it themselves. The tragedy also invited comparisons to historical events where dominant powers experienced collapse or reckoning after prolonged periods of unchecked authority. In Israel's case, the irony was intensified by the immediacy of the transformation. There was no slow erosion, no gradual shift in balance. The strike brought everything crashing down at once, making the contrast between past confidence and present ruin even more stark. In that collapse, a mirror was held up to history, forcing a confrontation with truths long ignored or denied. In the wake of the Iranian strike, the region stood at a fragile and uncertain crossroads. The destruction inflicted upon Israel was not just a moment of loss, but a turning point loaded with consequence. With infrastructure in disrepair, morale shaken, and the world's attention focused intensely on its response, Israel faced a choice between two divergent paths. The first was the familiar route of retaliation, a swift and powerful counterstrike intended to restore deterrence and reassert dominance. This option, deeply embedded in the political DNA of Israel, promised the illusion of regained control, but risked plunging the region into an even more catastrophic cycle of violence. The second path, however, was less certain, more fragile, but potentially transformative, a moment of introspection where shared suffering could open the door to a long, overdue reckoning with past actions and future possibilities. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had been defined by a pattern of action and reaction, with every offensive followed by a stronger response, leaving little room for dialogue. But now, with Israeli cities resembling the aftermath of conflicts it once waged beyond its borders, there existed a rare moment of common ground in pain and vulnerability. Civil society, once divided by ideology and history, now shared the universal experience of loss. This could become the seed of a new understanding, not just within Israel, but across the Middle East. Whether this moment would be seized by peacemakers or consumed by hawks remained uncertain, but the potential was real. Voices across the region began to speak more loudly about alternative futures. Some political leaders, intellectuals, and activists urged reflection rather than revenge. They called on Israel to see this devastation not just as a tragedy, but as an invitation to change course. They questioned whether endless cycles of war had delivered anything beyond death and rubble. Internationally, there was cautious hope that this event could shift deeply entrenched policies, that perhaps suffering on both sides might lead to a more equitable and sustainable vision for peace. However, this hope remained fragile. The risk of overreaction, of spiraling into wider regional warfare, loomed large. The strike had shaken the foundations of identity, security, and control, What came next would depend not on weapons, but on choices. The moment was precarious, the future unwritten, and the silence after the destruction seemed to ask the hardest question of all. Will we finally choose humanity over vengeance? 77 years after its founding, Israel faced a moment unlike any in its modern history, a moment not marked by celebration but by devastation. A single Iranian strike shattered illusions of invincibility, blurred the lines between power and powerlessness, and forced the world to witness a haunting symmetry between oppressor and oppressed. From the ruins of Tel Aviv to the shaken voices of its citizens, the very fabric of regional identity shifted. As the dust continues to settle, the world watches with breath held. Will this shared suffering awaken empathy, or will it harden walls that were already too high? In the face of destruction there lies an opening. Whether that opening leads to understanding or deeper darkness depends on what humanity chooses next. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and stay engaged through this powerful journey of history, pain, and perspective. May the courage to seek truth, the strength to embrace empathy, and the wisdom to choose peace guide us all forward. Good luck on your path, and may your voice continue to inspire deeper understanding in a world that needs it now more than ever. The Iranian strike marked a watershed moment, not just in the military history of the region, but in the psychological and symbolic dimensions of the Middle East conflict. Unlike previous engagements, which followed patterns of tension and retaliation, this strike was unprecedented in precision, coordination, and impact. It was not merely a show of strength. It was a deliberate message sent across borders, targeting the very heart of Israeli confidence. Whether launched through swarms of drones designed to evade radar, or a barrage of advanced missiles launched simultaneously to overwhelm the Iron Dome, the strike demonstrated a significant evolution in Iranian capability. Intelligence systems, long believed to be the crown jewel of Israeli security, were caught off guard. Even Israel's cyber defense grid, known for thwarting countless attacks, faced disruption. The attack pierced multiple layers of defense, suggesting deep reconnaissance, technological sophistication, and a strategic patience rarely associated with Iranian military tactics. The result was catastrophic. Power stations were hit, plunging cities into darkness. Communications infrastructure was disrupted, leaving civilians in confusion and panic. Several military installations were severely damaged, shaking the foundation of Israel's quick response capabilities. Yet, beyond the physical impact, the psychological toll was even more profound. For a nation built on the narrative of survival through strength, this moment flipped the script. For the first time in decades, Israeli civilians experienced the same terror, unpredictability, and helplessness that Palestinians in Gaza had long endured. The myth of invincibility dissolved. No longer was Israel the impenetrable stronghold perched above a volatile region. It became, if only for a moment, exposed, its fears no longer theoretical, but real, immediate, and devastating. Internationally, the strike sent ripples through allies and adversaries alike. Israel's traditional supporters were stunned by its vulnerability. The media, accustomed to framing Israel as a dominant force responding to threats, now reported on Israeli neighborhoods in ruins, emergency services overwhelmed, and civilians displaced. This shift in narrative was profound. The world, for a moment, looked at Israel not as a superpower in a conflict zone, but as a victim of sudden, calculated destruction. The Iranian strike did more than damage infrastructure. It changed the rhythm of the region, setting in motion a new chapter in which roles, expectations, and power balances were no longer predictable or one-sided.